All right, welcome to this explainer where we're going to unpack one of history's absolute most legendary encounters. We're talking about a massive collision between two complete extremes here, the world's most powerful, ambitious conqueror and its most notoriously impoverished, stubborn philosopher. We're looking at the iconic meeting between Alexander the Great and Diogenes of Sinope.
So let's dive right into section 1, the meeting of opposites.
Okay, so let's set the scene, right? The year is 335 BC. We are in a leafy suburb of Corinth, Greece, and a young Alexander the Great, literally dressed in shining armor, goes out of his way to find a guy who's living in an upturned clay barrel. Just picture this towering conqueror looking down at this sunbathing philosopher and making this crazy magnanimous offer. I like you, let me know your wish, and I shall grant it. Basically, he's offering the absolute wealth of an entire global empire to a man who literally owned nothing. He could have asked for a palace, a mountain of gold, whatever. And this is where we see the philosopher's total, unapologetic rejection of worldly power. Diogenes just kind of props himself up on his elbows and says, "Your shadow has fallen over me. Stand a little less between me and the sun." What a punchline. He dismisses the ruler of the known world as just an annoying shadow blocking his sunlight. You can totally imagine Alexander's whole sycophantic entourage just gasping in shock, right? Fully expecting the guy to be struck down on the spot for his insolence.
But surprise, Alexander doesn't strike him down. Actually, he gives this incredibly admiring response, which honestly perfectly frames the central tension of our whole explainer today. He turns to his mocking friends and says, "If I were not Alexander, I should like to be Diogenes." It's such a profound admission. It really shows us two men who both sought absolute, total freedom, but they went about it through entirely opposite extremes.
Which brings us to section 2, the way of the dog. Now, to really get why Diogenes was living in a barrel to begin with, you have to realize this wasn't just, eccentric laziness. It was a highly intentional, radical lifestyle. It was born from his exile and his absolute mission to, as he put it, debase the coinage of social convention. See, he was a founder of cynicism, from the Greek kainikos, which literally means dog-like. He believed society's rules were completely fake and true virtue meant living according to nature, simply and shamelessly. The guy owned nothing but a cloak, a stick, and a little wallet for scraps. There's even this famous story where he sees a young boy drinking water out of his cupped hands, and Diogenes just instantly throws away his own wooden bowl, basically saying a kid had outdone him in simplicity. He acted so far outside normal polite society that the Athenians literally just called him the dog. And when you look at this, the contrast in their worldviews is just beautiful. On the one side, you've got Alexander, right? The ultimate conquest of the external world. He's driven by this relentless ambition and will to master the entire globe. But then on the other side, you have Diogenes, who represents the complete conquest of the internal self. He mastered himself by just eliminating all physical and social needs. He built up his resilience by doing things like rolling in hot sand in the summer and literally hugging icy statues in the winter. He entirely conquered his own comfort. Let's move on to section 3, the meaning of the sun. So the single, incredibly brief anecdote basically became a philosophical mirror for later thinkers. Everyone saw their own values reflected in that blocked sunlight. The Greek philosopher Dio, for example, saw it as a test of bold speech, or parrhesia, basically testing whether a good king could tolerate honest criticism. Fast forward a bit, and the modern philosopher Peter Sloterdijk viewed it as the ultimate negation of the power of desire. Samuel Johnson? He saw it as a very literal commentary on time theft, basically saying Alexander stealing Diogenes' sunlight was a metaphor for people wasting other people's time. And then you have novelist Henry Fielding, who viewed it as a critique of both men, highlighting their false greatness and sheer arrogance.
But then, right around the Middle Ages, the whole interpretation shifts again. Writers like John Gower totally reframe the story, arguing that Alexander was actually, quote, the servant of his servant. Why? Well, they reasoned that Alexander's mind was completely enslaved by his worldly ambitions. Diogenes, on the other hand, had subjected his worldly desires entirely to his reason. So in their view, Diogenes was the true master, making the great king the actual slave in this encounter.
But all of this brings us to a pretty massive question. Did they actually meet? Did this perfectly crafted philosophical collision really happen? Or is it just some clever literary invention meant to teach us a lesson? Well, when we actually trace the history of the story, we find a super interesting connection. One of Diogenes' own pupils, a guy named Onesicritus, actually served as Alexander's chief pilot during his campaigns in Asia. So
Honestly, it's highly likely that Onesicritus just created this anecdote as a teaching tool. I mean, think about it. What better way to harmonize the incredible, globe-spanning deeds of his new boss, the king, with the hardcore discipline principles of his old teacher, the dog? And from there, the story just spread like wildfire. It got picked up by Cicero, Seneca, Plutarch, and they all kind of added their own little embellishments to the narrative.
Which naturally leads us to Section 4, the Zeus-born theory.
Okay, this is where it gets really crazy. Historical researcher Andrew Chugg proposes this fascinating detective story. He suggests this entire mythos might actually stem from a massive case of mistaken identity. See, the literal Greek translation of the name Diogenes is Zeus-born. And in Homer's epics, like the Iliad and Odyssey, Diogenes is this highly coveted title applied to massive heroes like Patroclus, Ajax, and Odysseus. Now, we know for a fact Alexander was totally obsessed with Homeric heroes, and he actively wanted this exact title for himself, especially after the high priest at the Siwa oracle in Egypt formally greeted him as the son of Zeus. When you actually compile the historical evidence, it points to a pretty wild conclusion. Early texts say Alexander founded Alexandria as the Zeus-born. Indian kings reportedly greeted him as the third Diogenes to visit their land. There is literally a stone relief dedicated to Alexander's closest companion, Hephaestion, that is signed simply from Diogenes. So it is highly, highly probable that Alexander himself formally used the title Diogenes, meaning that famous, seemingly impossible historical coincidence where Alexander and Diogenes the Cynic supposedly died on the exact same day in 323 BC? Yeah, that might just be a massive historical mix-up. Writers probably noted that Diogenes, meaning Alexander, died that day, and later historians just confused him with the philosopher.
Anyway, let's head into our final section, Section 5, an enduring cultural legacy.
Regardless of whether it's perfectly historically exact, the cultural footprint of this encounter is absolutely massive. It shaped centuries of art, literature, and how we view human priorities. Authors absolutely loved using this story to just flip the social hierarchy upside down. Take Francois Rabelais in 1532, for example. He writes this comedic reversal where he imagines both men in the afterlife. In hell, Alexander the Great is reduced to this miserable tailor, desperately patching old breeches for a wretched living. Meanwhile, the incredibly poor philosopher Diogenes is strutting around pompously with a golden scepter, occasionally beating Alexander when he does a bad job on the sewing. It's hilarious.
And visual artists were just as obsessed with the scene. You've got it painted on 16th century ceramics, carved in 17th century marble, and brilliantly captured in 1848 by Edwin Landseer. He painted this famous piece portraying Alexander as a haughty white bulldog, looking down at Diogenes, who is this scruffy little terrier living in a barrel. And actually, fun fact here, that specific painting of the two dogs literally inspired Disney's classic animated film, Lady and the Tramp. No way, right? But to really bring it all together, there's this telling version of the tale shared by the mystic Osho. In his retelling, Diogenes asks Alexander why on earth he's trying to conquer the world. Alexander says that once he conquers India, and then the whole world, he'll finally be able to rest and relax. Diogenes just bursts out laughing. He points to his dog and says, "Listen to this mad king. He says he will rest after he conquers the world. There's enough space here for us all. I am already resting. Why create so much disturbance around the world just to rest at the end of it?" Alexander has to admit it makes sense, but he tells him he's already mid-journey and just can't stop. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. We spend so much of our own lives chasing these external milestones, right? Wealth, promotions, status, always telling ourselves that once we finally achieve them, then we can be at peace. So, if you had to choose, would you conquer the world to find rest, or simply rest in the sun today? Who was truly the free man in this story? And, more importantly, which path would you choose? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the world around you.